Welcome back, Social Studies class. This is the last reading of the year for Japan and Europe in ruins after World War II. We're going to read about the Nuremberg trials and some of the post-war politics that got set up because of those. And we're also going to read about the gentleman on the left and the war crimes that he faced 50 years later. The Nuremberg trials. While nations were struggling to recover politically and economically, they also tried to deal with the issue of war crimes. During 1945 and 1946, an international military tribunal representing 23 nations put Nazi war criminals on trial in Nuremberg, Germany. In the first of these Nuremberg trials, 22 Nazi leaders were charged with waging a war of aggression. They were also accused of committing crimes against humanity, the murder of 11 million people. Adolf Hitler, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, and Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels had committed suicide long before the trials began. However, Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, and other high-ranking Nazi leaders remained to face the charges. Hess was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Göring received a death sentence, but cheated the executioner by committing suicide. 10 other Nazi leaders were hanged on October 16th of 1946. Hans Frank, the slayer of Poles, was the only convicted Nazi to express remorse. 1,000 years will pass, he said, and still this guilt of Germany will not have been erased. The bodies of those executed were burned at the concentration camp of Dachau. They were cremated in the same ovens that had burned so many of their victims. Post-war Japan. The defeat suffered by Japan in World War II left the country in ruins. 2 million lives had been lost. The country's major cities, including the capital, Tokyo, had been largely destroyed by bombing raids. The atomic bomb had turned Hiroshima and Nagasaki into blackened wastelands. The Allies had stripped Japan of its colonial empire. Occupied Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, who had accepted the Japanese surrender, took charge of the U.S. occupation of Japan. MacArthur was determined to be fair and not to plant the seeds of a future war. Nevertheless, to ensure that peace would prevail, he began a process of demilitarization, or disbanding the Japanese armed forces. He achieved this quickly, leaving the Japanese with only a small police force. MacArthur also began bringing war criminals to trial. Out of 25 surviving defendants, former Premier Hideki Tojo and 6 others were condemned to hang. MacArthur then turned his attention to democratization, the process of creating a government elected by the people. In February of 1946, he and his American political advisors drew up a new constitution. It changed the empire into a constitutional monarchy, like that of Great Britain. The Japanese accepted the constitution. It went into effect on May 3rd of 1947. MacArthur was not told to revise the Japanese economy. However, he was instructed to broaden land ownership and increase the participation of workers and farmers in the new democracy. To this end, MacArthur put forward a plan that required absentee landlords with huge estates to sell land to the government. The government then sold the land to tenant farmers at reasonable prices. Other reforms pushed by MacArthur gave workers the right to create independent labor unions. All right, we're going to go back up here and read about this modern war criminal. A new war crimes tribunal. In 1993, the UN, which is the United Nations, established the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia to prosecute war crimes committed in the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s. This was the first international war crimes court since those held in Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II. The ICTY issued its first indictment in 1994 and began trial proceedings in 1996. By mid-2007, 161 defendants had been indicted. Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs, remain at large. The most prominent of those charged was Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of Yugoslavia. He was charged with 66 counts of genocide, crimes against humanity, and other war crimes. On March 11th, 2006, Milosevic, who had suffered from poor health, was found dead in his cell. All right, we're going to continue to read about Japan here to finish up. Occupation brings deep change. A new constitution was the most important achievement of the occupation. It brought deep changes to Japanese society. A long Japanese tradition had viewed the emperor as divine. He was also an absolute ruler whose will was law. The emperor now had to declare that he was not divine. That admission was as shocking to the Japanese as defeat. His power was also dramatically reduced. Like the ruler of Great Britain, the emperor became largely a figurehead, a symbol of Japan. The new constitution guaranteed that real political power in Japan rested with the people. The people elected a two-house parliament called the Diet. All citizens over the age of 20, including women, had the right to vote. The government was led by a prime minister chosen by a majority of the Diet. A constitutional Bill of Rights protected basic freedoms. One more key provision of the Constitution, Article 9, stated that the Japanese could no longer make war. They could fight only if attacked. In September of 1951, the United States and 47 other nations signed a formal peace treaty with Japan. The treaty officially ended the war. Some 6 months later, the U.S. occupation of Japan was over. However, with no armed forces, the Japanese agreed to a continuing U.S. military presence to protect their country. The United States and Japan, once bitter enemies, were now allies. In the post-war world, enemies not only became allies. Sometimes allies became enemies. World War II had changed the political landscape of Europe. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged from the war as the world's two major powers. They also ended the war as allies. However, it soon became clear that their post-war goals were very different. This difference stirred up conflicts that would shape the modern world for decades. So, after World War II, former enemies like the United States and Japan eventually emerged as allies, and the United States and Japan are allies today. But former allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged after the war as enemies. So if you want further reading through the summer, you can look up things that happened during the Cold War, things that continue to shape events of the 20th century. I hope you enjoyed this reading, and the quiz will be posted tomorrow on Classroom. Hope you have a great rest of your day.